And we're back. So, what is this marvel of aquatic engineering that we're looking at? Well, it's the first boat that I've ever built in From the Depths, because we're doing a retrospective of my journey of playing From the Depths, what roles these craft played when I built them, and given how From the Depths has evolved, well, one, do they even still work because of mechanics changing? And two, do they still fill that same role today? Because the craft that they've been paired against, or were paired against in the past, may no longer exist, or may have been significantly upgraded. So it's interesting to see both how my building has evolved and how Neater itself has evolved, because, well, I've come a long way, and I still have a long way left to go. And the meta in Neater and what the different difficulty classes mean has changed quite a lot. So this vehicle, it's a little expensive. It was intended to be just the beginner starting boat, and it did used to be significantly cheaper than it was now, because costs have been rebalanced significantly. But, well, you get more materials now than you used to before, and this was too expensive for a starting boat when it was built, and it's too expensive for one now. Not only that, when I built it, it was not cost effective, and it is not cost effective now. So it has some stuff that's been changed a lot, like Steam. The Steam engine still works, it's still bad, it was bad before. It works as long as the ammo storage that is sitting directly next to it on both sides does not get hit. The armor scheme is almost entirely nonsensical. It's hard to be consistent with armor to make sure that your craft don't have obvious weak spots where HE or that sort of stuff can blow through. I still struggle with that, but at least I'm better than I used to be. It's also got some small blocks just chilling, scattered in a bunch of places. Another thing that hopefully I don't do as much as I used to do. We'll see that a lot in some of the earlier craft. It also has some gaffes, like this guy that needs 4 intakes but has 7. These are actually heat frag. I think heat frag shells that are this big are absolutely terrible. I think heat in general is just a bad choice for Neater. Crafts tend to be way more resilient against it than Hesh, mostly due to a lack of spall liners. They have air gaps but no spall liners. This is a meta choice, but personally I would rather use Hesh than heat in Neater all the time. Cram cannons have been totally reworked, so these still do fire. The reload time is astronomical. It's 36 seconds. I think they used to reload significantly faster, but I didn't rework them when Cram was reworked because there's no reason to rework this stuff. So they've gotten a lot worse than they were before, and they were never good. They're also just pure HE, and despite the fact that Cram was reworked, this was not a good Tetris when I built it, and it is even worse today. So let's put it up against a newer craft that you might see in the beginning of a Neater playthrough, and we'll just look, is it any good? Or is it any better or worse? The problem is, it's not going to do well with the first shot. The Pinjandrum is going to have an advantage in that it's probably going to hit the first shot, and we didn't, and we have an astronomical reload speed. If it actually gets its weapons on us, I don't know what's happening here. It has issues sometimes. It makes it fair. Does it have detection problems? Failsafe problems on this paddle? Something's making it not shoot that reliably. So we're seeing the fragment and heat damage rack up a little bit. It's got simple weapons that are firing. This turret pops. It is not ammo ejected. And it is not properly armored either. It's got too much wood in the wrong places, and HE will easily blow through. It's not clipping or HE damage propagation issues, it's a very poor armoring scheme. But it's doing work until it gets destroyed. There are also repair bots on these. Many of my early craft have repair bots. Too many repair bots, to be fair. This is 5 or 6, I think. And it's a small vehicle, so that's a lot. It's still not enough to save it if it actually takes a lot of damage. But it does function. It can fight. It took off one of these cram cannons. It doesn't even always beat the Pinjandrum, but This is a vehicle that you could conceivably spawn into Neater and fight the Deepwater Guard with it. Is it as cost-effective as some random early game vehicle that you might build with fairly low experience? Well, no. It could be worse, but, you know, how much worse could it actually be? So I looked at this and said, okay, I can't use this for Neater. I need to make something a little bit better. So I did, and let's take a look at it, because as soon as something like Captain Sal's fleet would spawn in, this just isn't going to cut it. And that's going to happen even in easy campaigns, so no, we need something a little bit better. And here's something that's a little bit better. This craft really does hold a dear place in my heart, because as far as I can recall, this is the second boat that I ever built, and it's the first boat that I ever used in the Neater campaign. It's a little bit cheaper than the previous vehicle, it's a little bit faster, it has lower percent armor cost, but it's actually tankier, especially against the Deepwater Guard that have a real love of high explosive. It's got missiles. These are very noob friendly. If you're just getting into From the Depths, I really suggest trying these out to use against the Deepwater Guard. It's easy to slap some down, to tune them, make something like this, it'll work. It doesn't have too many guidance modules or too many explosive modules, so it's fairly agile and can hit a variety of targets. Maybe not the flying squirrel, but still some medium, small, quick craft, a lot of the easier airships and planes in Deepwater Guard. It's not fast enough to fight the lightning hoods, it might not punch enough to fight the Onyx Watch, but it really gets you started. Of course, well, in enough numbers, these will still fight the Onyx Watch. Thrust duration, not too much fuel. These are fine. Really not a problem with them. This APS gun, this is not built badly in terms of the shells. The Tetris is poor but acceptable. The main issue is I just really didn't expect, or I did not really appreciate that APS is way less firepower dense than missiles, so I have too much armor for too little gun. This is just too much space dedicated to a gun that just does not do that much. And then these solid shot shells, these are absolutely fine. They go 1 kilometer per second, they have 30 armor pierce. You know, ideally they'd go a little bit faster, have a little bit more armor pierce, but this is the Deepwater Guard, they're made out of wood, it's already wasting armor piercing, and this was not a good choice. I should have used some other shell, but not terrible. So, other than that, well, there are problems with this craft, of course. Some of them are because it's dated, like it uses batteries and RTGs, which I don't use anymore, because they're just too expensive. This craft would actually be very modest if those were cut out, and actually pretty good. Not by my current standards, but you know, to play the early campaign, it would go a lot better than it does now. But this whole little, like, tons of small boilers into this tiny little compact turbine is pretty degenerate, and it used to be highly efficient and highly effective. It's just not anymore. It got fixed. For the good, well, it uses stone here instead of heavy armor. A craft like this, metal slope, metal beam, air gap, stone, that's enough. It's not a good armor scheme, but it's way better than using heavy armor. Now, this ammo storage will blow into here. I thought I built this before the ammo rework, so I don't know why the ammo extractable matches the ammo required so much. I don't know if I was lucky or if I was actually still using this craft after the ammo rework and modified the ammo storage a little bit. It has hydrofoils and propellers to keep it stable because this thing barely floats, so when it takes damage it can run into issues. That's the same reason for all of this wood. It's not armor, it's buoyancy. So let's take a look at how it works. Let's see if it still fills the same role it did when I built it. Because before, I would just spend all of my money in the beginning of the campaign building these to work against everything the Deepwater Guard had to offer. I would lose them sometimes, but they weren't that expensive, and they were sufficiently cost-effective that they just carried me through the Deepwater Guard campaign. And I think putting them against the Pilferer, which I believe has been rebuilt at least once since I built these, is a good test. We can see they tank this. These might be flak explosions, which would explain why they're being tanked so easily. They tank them pretty well, or at least have some flak mixed in there. Deal a very respectable amount of damage back. And all in all, if you're a beginner, you make a vehicle like this, it does a lot of mistakes, a lot of things wrong with it, a lot of things that can be improved, but it's a learning experience. It doesn't take a lot of experience to build a craft like this. I did go and learn a few things and tweak a few things and optimize a few things since the previous craft, but this was still not a big time commitment for me. So I think it's good to see that this is actually still effective against early game Deepwater Guard craft, and a new player to Neater now can have a similar experience to what I had 5 years ago. So I'm actually pretty happy about that. Like many of you, my first real challenge in From the Depths was the Flying Squirrel. Of course, the Flying Squirrel back then did not have the teeth that it does now, but it was still very annoying to hit and needed a dedicated craft for it. So I wanted to build something that was fast. So Flying Squirrels would just keep attacking my harvesters, and my boats were way too slow, and I didn't want static defenses or fleets just sitting on defense all the time. So I built these, which are fast enough. You can still make way faster craft, but they're fast enough to scramble to intercept Deepwater Guard aircraft. They don't have a lot of power. It's enough, and they're very, very heavily armored compared to most air superiority fighters, and they don't try to dodge missiles at all. They just face tank everything. The reason behind that was that craft in Neater used to just be pinatas. You'd hit them, especially Deepwater Guard craft, they'd blow up and all the candy would come out, but they didn't really hit back. At least not so much that tanky craft couldn't just absorb it all. So this one, this has a much improved armor scheme from previous craft. There's a lot of empty air here that you can't really blow up. There's a lot more full beams, so you don't have these little cracks that damage just slips through. At least not a lot of them. There are still some. Unfortunately, this doesn't function as redundantly as it looks like it should, given all of this stuff. You actually don't have to take out very much of this to get it to fall out of the sky. Now, the Flying Squirrel is way more expensive than it used to be and comes in groups of 3. So we're going to spawn in a second one of these, and let's spawn in some Flying Squirrels. So, Flying Squirrel, much bigger teeth than it has before, and much larger nuts as well. Wrong button. 30 firepower. Pretty expensive. These are missiles. They're very slow missiles, but they are missiles, and they hit like a truck. Now, we could very easily one-shot these. We could also very easily not one-shot these multiple times. As far as I can tell, these are actually harder to hit than the old Flying Squirrels. So our somewhat lackluster but previously good enough detection struggles more than it used to. Still does hit things though. We're still racking up damage slowly but surely. We should... We managed to dodge it. That's actually not common. So in this case, it was an overwhelming victory. Usually we take a few large missiles and they blow some pretty big chunks out of the size. Got lucky there. It's still almost always a victory, so I don't know if the Flying Squirrels still spawn in easy mode campaigns. If they do, they are going to be a significantly larger hurdle than they used to be, but spawns are getting rebalanced, so I hope that won't be a problem. But, somewhat poorly constructed air superiority fighters, especially these were built before the stability change, and I don't really put lasers on airplanes as much as I used to. The same with any hit scan weapons. I tend to use more stable platforms for them now that don't have stability issues. These don't have enough stability issues that it's probably a huge issue, but they might be better if they don't move around so much in battle to actually hit things. But they still fight the Flying Squirrel. They don't do it as well as they did before. It's definitely more of a roadblock for a new player to climb up than it used to, and it was always infamous for being a roadblock. But still achievable. This still fits the same role it did before. early game air superiority fighter. So we're starting to see things are being a bit different as we're getting a little further into the campaign, but still not a huge amount of difference. I guess the last vehicle I'm going to show that never actually made it onto camera, although I did actually build this fairly soon following the other vehicles that I've shown. There weren't many vehicles in between these, but I built this one because I needed more firepower than I had on my small vehicles, and I didn't just want to spawn in 1,000 of them to kill the Davy Jones outpost, or some of the Onyx Watch installations that have a ton of armor, or some of the new vehicles that were starting to creep up into the, middle hundreds of thousands of resources, 200, 300,000 resources, that were just taking huge swarms of the smaller vehicles. So I put this together. It shoots relatively slow shells, 382 meters per second. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's slow. Large missiles, which are, these only have one thing of fins. They're designed to hit slow vehicles. This is designed to shoot down at installations or large ships like the Crossbones. Back when I built it, this thing had ACVs to make it bounce, but I got bored of the fact that none of the ships could actually hit it, so I made it stop bouncing, so it'd take fire back. If I used it with the ACVs as of when I first built it, it would be much more effective in these tests, and if you're doing a similar thing, and you really just want your vehicle to be as efficient as possible, well, I definitely suggest making it bounce. It'll certainly be better. Although, it will decrease the stability. It's certainly still worth it. I have deck guns here. I got really tired of HE damage leaking through the non-existent gap between the turret cap and the deck and blowing up my guns. That's not a problem anymore. You don't have to build deck guns because of that, but for a while I only built deck guns. That was a small phase, because all of my turrets were getting popped without them even taking any damage. There's some finer details to that I'll talk about later, but that's like the general thing. I still think that deck guns are fine. I like the fact that they have a lot of armor you can point at the enemy. You could build this barrel into all the armor. It would look like a mini kobold that you just point at your enemy. I still think you can only really do it for airships, because you either need to mount them onto the side or the bottom so that your craft isn't just insanely top heavy, or you need to have an excavated section of your hull so you just have armor and then no side armor or anything, and then the turret in there. So it sort of looks like one of those shipping ships that just has a big scoop out of it, which is kind of ugly, but works fine. As for the rest of this craft, it has some somewhat deprecated stuff in it, like these metal ducts. You used to be able to see through them. So this laser warner used to work, this active radar used to work, and this munition warner used to work. None of them work anymore. It has a little bit of an area to walk around. I never really fleshed it out, but this was the first craft that I really spent time putting a place for my avatar to be and to chill and exist. And then, this interior is a bit of a mess. I don't remember what it used to look like. I know that, despite the fact that I never really used this craft for very long, maybe this is actually set to still bounce. I don't think it works. We'll see that it doesn't work. Maybe these are both disabled. Doesn't look like it. Yeah, these are definitely enabled. So maybe it should still be bouncing. It certainly doesn't, though. And I'm not going to investigate why, because I'm never going to use this craft again. But again, even though I didn't use this craft for that long, I tore up and replaced the insides at some point, and at this point I can't remember why. I know it used to have Betty blades on the outside, but I got rid of them because it would get sunk after like literally one shot. But that's pretty much all that there is to this. Let's see if it still does the thing. One of the big things about this is that I don't really use flares anymore because there's so many beam riders and remote guidance missiles and signal processors that it's very hard to get flares to work in the campaign nowadays. This wasn't designed to be an incredibly high difficulty craft, so it doesn't really have to worry about the beam riders and the remote guidance so much. But it still has to worry about craft that have signal processors. I expect the Palisade does, although I'm not 100% sure. I haven't actually looked. So the Palisade's a missile craft. We're going to shoot off our flares. Oh geez, our flares did not distract anything. So we also shoot missile interceptors. We don't stagger them because I hadn't really got that far into missiles yet. And there just aren't a lot of them because they're only meant to take out the stragglers. The good thing is that damaged missiles fly slower and deal less damage, and that we can tank HE damage pretty well. Yeah, the bad news is okay, it looks like we've distracted some missiles now. So that's good. And we're doing damage. I can see the HE damage racking up pretty well. We've stopped firing, and that's because I don't have RPM limits on these. Their cooling limit is significantly higher than their ammo intake limit and their autoloader limit. Also, missiles got nerfed a little bit in that dealing damage to them makes them slower, turn slower, deal less damage, that sort of thing, so they did get a bit of a nerf since this vehicle was built. Did this lock back onto us? These were definitely following a missile interceptor. Oh, and a flare. Oh yeah, and some of these are coming back. That's not great. Our flares are definitely not doing the work that they used to. I don't remember if the... Let's wait until we tank a few more, and a few more. Okay, so I'm curious, I think it's a Godly now. The Iron Cordon used to be highly susceptible to flares. Oh, I don't know if we have a flare loaded. Oh geez. Well, despite the fact that it launches missiles straight forwards towards you, it used to be highly susceptible to flares. And it still is fantastic. Palisade seems more resilient to flares, oddly, despite the fact that it uses a VLS. And you'd usually expect it to be less resilient to them, unless the designers were very careful about it. So the other thing that this vehicle was supposed to really be able to take on pretty well, although now that it doesn't bounce, I'll probably need 2 of them. And it's still going to be cheaper than the enemy vehicle, and the enemy vehicle can actually hit us, so... Fair beans is the Crossbones. The Crossbones is significantly more expensive than it used to be. I think it used to be something like 250,000. The rebuilt version of it, way more expensive. So, cram cannons can be hit by anti-munition now. The only thing is, I don't have them set up to fire if there are cram cannon shots detected, so they're just not going to use them. These would be a lot more effective if I did change that, but, well, I didn't. And also, there are frags coming out of these, which is definitely an upgrade for the Deepwater Guard over just the pure HE. Cram cannons are just not great with pure HE. They're still functional, but they're not great. The Crossbones also still does tend to come in at too steep an angle and not be able to get all of its guns firing all the time. So it's significantly sturdier, significantly more difficult to fight than it used to be. Obviously, here I'm not using a very good airship, and it's still turning out to be highly effective, even though these are very slow and don't really try to dodge things that much. So even some of these harder and retrofit Deepwater Guard craft, I could have also shown the Abactor or the Ransack against one of these, the results would be the same. Still pretty approachable, but starting with our next ship, we're going to be getting out of the Deepwater Guard and the Onyx Watch, which I'm basically skipping entirely, and onto some newer, or I shouldn't say newer factions, but factions that got significantly more changes, and I think their difficulty or even the style that you have to approach them with has changed significantly over the years. Now we've made it into things that I think got at least some screen time. I think one of my earliest campaign playthroughs had this show up, at least briefly. I decided to name this the Jackal. This is the fuel version. I don't have the original version at this point, and both were made fairly close together. One was a Steam RPG hybrid. The costs were just too high. This is when I realized, okay, we're just not going to do the RTG thing anymore. These are supposed to be like little dog ears. This has flares. I don't think they're really effective against almost anything at this point. I think we're also not quite capable of the top speed anymore. I think these hydrofoils produce more drag than they used to. As for what the vehicle is, it's a mix of moderately agile missiles so that they're able to hit smaller targets than some of my previous craft, as well as lasers. This is supposed to be a much stronger fly swatter than the Nega Squirrel. And I built this when I started running up against the Twin Guard, and in particular, I was running up against the Twin Guard drone fleets, and I was having trouble fighting them with other vehicles. As far as actual build quality, this thing's not terrible. It's got some weird stuff that I never really cleaned up. Like, I had extra space in here because I put some frequency doublers in. I don't really use them anymore because you just can't get through smoke anyway, so why even bother? And I find that they're rarely worth it. So for some reason I put in a bunch of 1 meter blocks with the F key, I think, and it filled the way up here too. There's some internal flight surfaces for steering. I still use that sometimes. Not that likely though. And then a few other 1 meter blocks filling in stuff, which, you know, it doesn't really hurt this craft all that much, but if I was putting something up on the Steam Workshop, I would want there to be somewhat of a higher level of craftsmanship. There's also still some RTGs hanging out, a relic from before the fuel engines and because of space constraints with the fuel engines. Honestly, these probably aren't that great. I'd probably want something more power dense than these for a craft like this that is firing energy weapons, but at least they're fuel efficient. And then I finally learned my lesson and put the missiles in separate blocks so that taking out one of them doesn't take out all of them. Of course, there aren't bulkheads here in between them, so there's still a reasonable chance that they'll all get taken out. Still have this turbine thing set up that doesn't function anymore the way it used to. One big block of ammo that if it gets destroyed, all is lost. I think we saw the AI at some point. I think it's very vulnerable to EMP. We've got some surge protectors, but this craft is just generally very susceptible to EMP. I was still sort of in the fuel efficient mode, so this thing has a cruise speed and a top speed. I don't know why it didn't record custom jet material burn for the top speed, because it does have CJEs. When it starts speeding up, these will get out of the water and actually fire. But because of all this stuff below the waterline, it's still not as fast as it should be. This would just be way better as an airship. I even realized that when I was building it. I love water skimmers, but they're so hard to justify. They're just so much worse in every aspect because of how easy it is to get something to fly. So the Enigma Swarm... Oh, there's one other thing that I should mention before I actually spawn this in. This turret does not have elevation. It needs the 25-degree firing arc to be able to hit things. I also don't have the target prioritization on the ship set very well, so it's not actually going to shoot at the small targets it should. These are things that... I don't know if these are actually submarines or not. We'll find out. These are things that I would definitely improve on future vehicles, but did not here. So it does... I hit Shift E instead of just E.
Receiving.
So it needs help
Now.
to tell it what to shoot at. Otherwise, it'll try to shoot this main drone carrier thing rather than the little sub guys. I don't think it has firing restrictions on the turret, so it'll sometimes try to shoot at enemy vehicles that it can't rather than re-engaging ones that it can.
Engaging now.
These are things that can be tweaked fairly quickly. So although the Twin Guard use EMP themselves, they're not always highly resilient to EMP. Now this thing's relatively modest speed it's slower than it used to be, 62 to 63 instead of 68. It gets it in trouble a little bit. We'll see that these enemies get within the firing arc, and it just can't shoot back at them. It uses infrared seekers as well, which occasionally have issues.
Engaging now.
It still works. It's still workable. These are issues that were a problem with it when I built it. There's still a problem with it now. The same with it not being resilient enough to EMP damage and built to fight the Twin Guard, who uses a lot of EMP. These missiles are also not really staggered, and they need to be, because missile interceptors now have a much bigger blast radius than they used to. At least I'm pretty sure that was changed at some point. I'm not even sure if we're firing flares anymore, actually. I don't think I've seen us fire a single flare. Well, this is not connected to a missile controller, so that's why we're not firing flares right now. Yeah, so those are important bits, but we still won. We're also definitely depleting our energy, and that's because our steam generation got nerfed a little bit. So, this thing still works against Twin Guard Swarmcraft. Twin Guard Swarmcraft tend to not be that strong, as long as you have a vehicle that can actually hit them. And this vehicle can still hit them. It does need some reprogramming, because when it was built, Swarmcraft did not have that main drone, so I didn't really have to worry about it. Now you actually need proper targeting to fight them, but other than that, things haven't changed or been like rug pulled on this that badly. It mostly still works. It has the same deficits that it did when I built it. I think they're even a bit heavier now. Being resilient to EMP is more important than it used to be, but you can still use this thing. And it was still hitting things despite the infrared seekers. I find these to be highly suspect. I put them on here so that it would tend to shoot at jets and that sort of thing, but like, sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And here we have the Anubis, which was the first vehicle I made that had my godly naming rules in effect, where anything intended to kill godlies had a godly name of its own. I was doing an Egyptian theme, and those vehicles were painted in a very gaudy color scheme with bright blue, gold, white, black, meant to really stand out. And this has a lot of firepower. It's because I was fighting against the lightning hoods, and my craft were having a lot of trouble engaging them. Even my craft that were more successful at engaging a variety of enemies had trouble with the incredibly high speed of the lightning hoods, so I slapped a bunch of railguns that shoot at 2 kilometers per second, one of which shoots hollow points and is a hedge against planes so that I don't punch very expensive holes through very cheap wings that are purely decorative. Rather, it would take a 20 to 30k chunk out of the craft. And then I think these are sabot rounds, which currently have far more armor pierce than they need. They were built in a day of heavy armor stacking that is no longer the case. And I would build these a little bit differently, but they're still not terrible. This was built when HE damage leakage was a problem, but if your turrets and your turret caps were big enough, and you armored your turret necks, which you don't have to do as much as you used to do, and if you armored the upper deck of your turret as well, which these actually have a full layer of armor on the upper deck of the turrets. They have deck armor and then upper deck armor on the turret. They insulate it from high explosive leakage pretty well. Some of the stuff to get that to not absolutely shred these is just not necessary anymore, but it may or may not be a good idea. This is fairly lightly armored. The frontal armor is pretty thin. There's a little bit of heavy armor in a few places, but really just a little bit. These days, that is just not enough armor for a vehicle this expensive. However, there's a period of time where Godlies and Neaters were basically giant pinatas. Sort of like the cheaper vehicles in Neater are still kind of pinatas. They're full of candy. You just blow them up and all the good stuff falls out and they don't hit back. The Marksman's craft and the Godlies, they hit back now. And this craft was highly reliant on active defenses. So it has lambs. It has... Interesting. This might be a old version of this. Not that there's much of a difference, but there should be a laser here so that if this isn't using the lambs, it can shoot small craft or a large craft with the laser, which has 50 laser firepower, so it can show actually how strong the lambs are on this, which, especially for its day, this is a lot of lambs. It used to be that slower speed, higher diameter ordnance without a lot of health was incredibly common in Eater. So strong lambs, strong active defenses, missile interceptors. This has a flare somewhere, I think. Although it's possible I ripped it out. Because this did have a few revisions, and I had to rebuild the Steam in this several times, because when I was working on this, there was this beta Steam update, and I was on the beta branch, and they kept changing it, and I had to keep rebuilding my engines. And I might have had to rip out the flare in order to get the new engines to fit. Oh, nope, still got a flare in it, so... We're still back in those days where I found active defenses were just much more efficient than armor, so... Shields, lambs, anti-missiles, flares, but not a lot of armor. I find that that's changed a lot, and that now armor is much more reliable than it used to be. The other thing is, this was built to fight the lightning hoods, but it has no smoke. So, back in the day, this would cost-effectively beat any Godly in the game, I think. And that's because the Godlies just weren't as strong as they were now. The Candela is one of those. Despite having no smoke, it would cost-effectively beat the Candela when I built it. Actually, I think it would one-on-one the Candela. Candela's been rebuilt since then. I think it's more expensive than it used to be. These used to be about the same cost, I think. The reason this doesn't have smoke is because the Candela used to have something like 300 AP, and smoke just didn't matter. Now, it matters. It really matters a lot. Unless we one-shot the lasers on the Candela, which is possible, we are not even going to come close. It is absolutely shredding us. So we're drilling little holes in it, and it is absolutely destroying us. This is just not going to go well, especially because we don't have much frontal armor, and we are about to start losing turrets. And there's a very strong chance that the Candela is not losing a lot of firepower. This is our firepower. Oh, actually we're going to win this one, aren't we? So, this is highly unlikely, but it is possible. We still punch deep holes into enemy vehicles, or at least we can. It seems like the Candela is pretty efficient at stopping these shells. There was a day when Lightning Hood's craft were so delicate that any of these shells other than the hollow point were guaranteed to rip through from one end to the other. That day has come and gone, but they're still moderately effective. So this thing can still kind of fight. If it had smoke, I think it would actually still be pretty effective against the Lightning Hoods, because smoke just hard counters everything, or just hard counters lasers so badly that you're not even playing against them anymore. But it is certainly not what it used to be, because if you're fighting against the Grey Talons or the Scarlet Dawn, and you went ahead and you spawned in 2 of these, say, I was just checking to see if the cost was actually close to the saved cost, and spawned in some difficult Godly, you'd be pretty much set. But things have changed. That barely dealt any damage compared to what it should have done, because this is just a mess of heavy armor wedges. This is meant to beat this type of vehicle, and it will not even be close. We just can't get through this armor. Oh, and we're also not nuke resilient. I think the later versions of this craft, I think I might have a small issue here. I think they would laser the nuke down, but these efficient nuke things that actually hit you were not a thing back when I built this. The small number of nukes and ramming vehicles in the game would almost never actually hit you, they just fall into the water. So we're just going to get absolutely bodied. The meta has shifted in Neater quite a bit, and you just can't build vehicles like this anymore. If you don't use, like, if you want to do a frontsider v frontsider and you don't do all of this heavy armor wedge spam, you're going to be in serious trouble. I think the way sloped armor works to defeat these solid rounds changed significantly as well, so it wasn't something that I was as concerned with now. So this is the first vehicle we're seeing where it just doesn't do what it needs to do anymore. It's not even close. Against non-frontsiders like this that aren't designed to hard counter us, well, it can still do some stuff, not at the level it used to, because the Godlies of the harder factions like the Scarlet Dawn, the Twin Guard, the Grey Talons, to a lesser extent the Steel Striders, they've moved on and got significantly more difficult than when I beat these vehicles, and they've got significantly better at 1v1 combat, but not necessarily better at fleet combat. Something like the Pyre is definitely designed to destroy a single target. It is not bad against the fleet of vehicles, but with all of this heavy armor and these wedges in the front, well, top attack missiles, swarms that fire it from all angles, I'd say it's a bit more vulnerable than some previous vehicles in iterations of Neater that we've seen to swarms. And after the Anubis, I had started to transition to flagships that are tankier, cheaper, and rely on additional vehicles backing them that would swarm enemies in order to take out these tougher combatants that are very good at one-on-one engagements. So here we have another flagship that was built a little bit later and uses some of those changes a little bit that I mentioned. This is a little bit tankier and uses its main laser system for lambs, which is not as strong in active defense as it used to be, but in the day made this thing incredibly tanky. It's also got a much lower profile, so if you're punching through it as a frontsider, the amount of armor that you have to get through is about 3 times what it was on the Anubis. There's also a lot of empty space here in the cockpit, although it's mostly decorative, that can still provide a fairly good defense against a lot of enemy vehicles. And then, I believe this has some missile interceptors hiding somewhere. This is still before I used APN guidance for these or turning thrusters, so same old stuff you'd see in a lot of other vehicles. High top speed, because it's intended to intercept fast enemy vehicles, especially a lot of the Steel Striders aircraft, which would attack my installations and make me really unhappy if I couldn't intercept them with something like this. But because it's relatively tanky, it's intended to be the center of a fleet. Now, more campaign designs are holding smoke than when I built this, so I just don't use this anymore. I don't think there's anything about this that is particularly non-viable as far as mechanics are concerned. The steam engines still work, the lasers still work, the CJEs still work, the lift jets still work. There's stuff it could do better, like have better point defense lasers that elevate and always shoot at small drones that come into target so it doesn't get rammed or hit with nukes and that sort of thing, but nothing about this has really been broken since I created it. It's just, it doesn't work as efficiently as it used to. And I'm going to spawn in a few vehicles alongside this that were created in a moderately similar timescale so that I can try out some of the fleet combat that it was designed for and see if it does okay against some of the newer designs. Okay, so I had to load in a lot of craft to bring this up to the cost of what I'm going to fight it against, and I didn't arrange these particularly efficiently, so strong chance they'll ram each other a little bit, and some of them will start a little bit far out from the engagement and not start firing soon enough. So alongside this, I put the skate, which I actually made at a pretty similar time to this. The other ones are a bit newer. The skate is a little water skimmer. These are sub-objects, so there's less drag It's a little cheaty, but it's the only way to get water skimmers to be somewhat viable. There's some issues with incredibly bad EMP defense, but the weapons themselves, remote guidance, heat, and these have just predictive guidance and radar seekers, but EMP frag. These little small EMP warheads don't do what they used to. I would use bigger EMP charges now, so that didn't age very well, but otherwise, these still work pretty well. They're still pretty good swarmcraft. They don't stagger their, as I mentioned with other previous craft, these do not stagger their missiles enough. With a large blast radius from missile interceptors, they need to stagger their missiles more. Almost all of these craft that shoot missiles suffer from that, including these guys, which are quite a bit newer. As well as, well, this uses a turret from the Tycho, so it's also quite a bit newer, the Drunken Duck, but this should get us to a pretty similar cost as the Pyre, so let's just see what happens. I'm actually going to bring it in pretty close so that all of our missile craft can shoot at it. Although it'll probably backpedal very quickly. In theory, we should be at least moderately resilient to it, although I didn't actually put in anything here that's going to shoot down the nukes it's building. So I should do that. Really bringing the game down to a crawl here, but I'm going to load 2 of these guys in. They're pretty cheap. I think they're actually should be good at shooting at the nukes instead of the main vehicle. Oh, they may not be doing that.
Listening.
Oh, yep, they did do it. Okay. Fantastic. We have nukes covered now. So we're actually landing hits on the Pyre. Our EMP is not doing what I would like. The Ra is taking damage acceptably, but not well. But it's buying time for the rest of our fleet to just chip away and deal damage. And that's, generally speaking, how I do these engagements these days. Because all these EMP heat spikes hitting the sides can make life very difficult, although it is still firing pretty acceptably. And we're having a bit more trouble hitting it than I would expect for some reason, although we are still hitting it. However, the way EMP interacts with heavy armor now is not what you'd really like most of the time. So this is certainly better than the Anubis attempt. Is it good? Well, that is certainly debatable, but it's doing better, and this seems to have aged a little bit better as a strategy. It's a little bit of a meta call because it depends on how good the secondaries are. And the Ra is going to get more and more effectively tanky as the Pyre loses weaponry. So it depends on how good the secondaries are on these giant neater craft, because if this thing has secondaries that just annihilate my swarmcraft, well, okay, we're not looking so good anymore. If it doesn't, then they will just absolutely demolish this thing. Well, it just tries to take out the one big vehicle that I think it actually successfully removed laser firepower from the Ra. We are not getting... Nope, it still has laser firepower, it's just not shooting back for some reason. There we go. I think it lost some build defects with it. It lost these side lasers, and it's draining all of its lambs uselessly. Which means it's not firing with these lasers. Once those missiles are gone, it's actually going to start engaging again. Smoke, so not dealing a lot of damage back, but the Pyre has been nerfed pretty badly by all of these heat and EMP weaponry, and it's just not really doing anything anymore. Of course, I didn't put any vehicles in against it. They're actually really good at chunking armor, so it's taking a long time to actually kill it. The Drunken Duck may be the only thing that's actually doing respectable damage back. But it shows how you can really chip away at these. If I was to build more vehicles to put in against this now, I'd probably have some plasma to actually take this thing down eventually. Yeah, so those shots that drilled in pretty deep, those were Drunken Duck shots, which are AP frag, I believe. They should be the same weaponry from the Tycho. They're pretty nasty if they hit side armor that often does not have those wedges to mitigate damage. So they're highly efficient alongside a larger vehicle to laser down craft. And the pyre is falling, despite the fact, not quite falling, but it's not fighting back anymore. So this shows the effectiveness of putting together a fleet like this of craft that, on their own, these are not particularly high difficulty, any of these. There was a day when the Ra was very scary against most Neater craft. But for the most part, the work is being done by some of these unassuming vehicles that, if you were to put them in Neater, the sailfish, which are shooting some of these large missile barrages, they might be mediums. The skates would probably be somewhere in the hard difficulty, although they're highly efficient compared to most small craft in Neater, so these might actually fall into the Godly category. For little 58,000 cost craft, these guys are actually terrifying. You can use them in the early game, you can use them in the late game, they're fine. Are they incredibly well constructed? Well, no. People build much better small craft, but I do think that this showcases that the paradigm I have to use to take down a lot of these Neater craft has changed over the years. I can't just keep using the same ships and the same tactics, and regardless of whether ships get better or they get worse over time, the metagame certainly does evolve, and tactics have to change as time goes on as a result of that. And now this one will do just a very brief showcase of some of the designs that just don't work at all because of mechanics changes. Here we have a ramming vehicle, which, due to how melee was rebalanced, just does not do enough damage to justify its cost anymore. It used to be that rams, even on small vehicles, were absolutely terrifying, and this could drill its way through almost anything in the game. Enemies would do similar things to you, so I didn't really feel that bad about it, especially if Neater can't take what they can deal out. This outer shell will spin if there's actually an enemy. It torque rolls the thing a little bit, so it doesn't do that when there's no enemy. This is also back in the breadboard days when you couldn't really ram things without a breadboard. This would be more effective with an AI now than the breadboard. It also has 4-meter rubber beams backing the spikes, because if this clips too far into an enemy in one tick, which it certainly can, well, it could collide with something other than the ram and just detonate. That's never been fixed, so that's part of the reason that I don't really use rams anymore. Not that they are totally ineffective or that sort of thing. Sometimes I just use them in place of rubber in some vehicles. I've got this poor little guy. This poor little guy used to be pretty fast, but not so fast anymore. Half or less than the top speed it used to have. Little particle cannon fighter. For some old episodes, you'll see this show up, me fighting the Deepwater Guard in with it, as well as some other craft, maybe from the Steel Striders. I was using it mostly as an interceptor in, I think, the Beta Branch campaign playthrough that I was doing. Fortunately, the mechanics with wings just don't work anymore, that they're reliant on the top speed of the craft and not the speed from the sub-object, so this kind of flapping stuff just no longer even a tiny bit effective. In addition, there are two crafts that I won't show here, which were not changed from mechanics, but it's their names that I had to change. If you remember, Archer had some issues, the TV show, because the name ISIS got taken by a terrorist organization. Well, due to my naming convention, I also had a ship named the ISIS that I had to rename, And I also had one that I named the Police Brutality just before George Floyd was murdered, and I renamed that one because the name felt very distasteful at that point. It was actually called the Police Brutality because of a rock climb in Georgia called Police Brutality, but, well, that doesn't really matter. All that matters is I had to rename it. So, moving forwards, we have the Tycho. In some extent, it's moving backwards because the Drunken Duck is actually a newer ship than the Tycho, given that it uses the Tycho weaponry. It also brings one of these rhyming vehicles in tow, which does very little. The variation on the Tycho does have a nuke. The nuke doesn't always successfully go off, but it does have one. This was in my pure helium airship days. There is an upthruster here somewhere, but it's just to keep the nose up. If there's damage to the nose, it's not actually to lift the entire vehicle. Other than that, it uses 3 railguns that shoot AP frag shells that are actually pretty scary. Not as scary as they used to be, because if you put this against one of the big godlies like the Pyre, it's just not going to be able to punch through. So this either needs to fight a broadsider, or it needs to be... If it's fighting something like the Pyre, you really need 2 of these so that one of them can get around it. It switches broadsides to spare its armor a little bit, but you can see this vehicle is mostly empty space. And I think that's a tactic that's actually aged well and just better and better as time has gone on, because neater vehicles have gone more and more towards piercing packs and solid shot. And the harder, higher difficulty things have been moving away from HE and frag into the stuff that really messes this vehicle up. So currently the meta has been swinging in its favor a little bit. It's still a pure helium airship, and there are downsides that are going to come with that. But it can at least fight a little bit. It is cheaper than sort of any of these craft, so you wouldn't really put them on a 1v1 against it. Especially looking at about 700,000. Not a huge amount of firepower and a lot of armor compared to some of my other vehicles. The AP frag round style in general, I think, tends to have a little bit less firepower than pure AP. Whether or not that means it's actually worse, well, that's its own guess. I never know which ones of these are actually fleetcraft and which ones aren't. I thought that was going to be a collision for sure. I don't know what those missiles are doing. So this ramming is not going to do that much. Actually, the best we can hope for is for a nuke to go off, which it did, and dealt a little bit of damage. Or for it to... Sometimes it'll just drown enemies. I'm waiting for a volley. I want to see how much damage it does. We did not hit very well there. Let's wait for another volley. One of those might be doing APHE. So, the Tycho looks like it's doing pretty well. I think it'll generally tank. Let me make sure I have repair tentacles disabled. Okay, good, they were disabled. In general, I think it's going to tank a lot of this fire pretty well. It doesn't have amazing missile defense. The empty space is actually pretty good against HE as well, although it's really better against a lot of the railguns that have showed up compared to missiles. And really doesn't like fighting this type of front-sider enemy, but still does a respectable turnout. Especially this guy is starting to get into this frontal armor where things stop looking so good, but it still does okay. As far as penetration goes, it's still going to put holes into a lot of vehicles, especially some of the more lightly armored ones. Shelling ships is always a fun pastime. you do have to actually hit the thing, which seems to be more of a problem than I was expecting for some of these engagements. But this style of putting a lot of empty space into your craft, well, is something that I found to be growing on me over time, and I've been making slightly less dense vehicles. Although, if you still want to make like just a 1v1 front-sider that would fight against something like the Pyre or some similar neater ships that have really going all into that, shooting a lot of like a Pierce, a bowhead, solid shot, you still really can't beat that strategy of just stacking heavy armor beams in the front. Of course, I haven't adjusted that much as far as the meta is concerned for plasma, where you'd expect this to be incredibly resilient against plasma because there just aren't a lot of connected blocks anywhere on this vehicle. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out going forward even further in the future. And especially once plasma weaponry starts making its way into Neater, I'm going to be very interested to see if that makes this kind of ship even better than it is now. And I think it's that time already. To some extent, I have been skipping through a lot of newer vehicles, more than I could have compared to some of the older ones, but it has been a while since I've built this craft. Though mechanics had largely stabilized since I built it, so none of the stuff has really changed much. It's more the enemy vehicles that have changed one way or the other. Now, when I built this, as goes for a lot of my fan builds, this is more supposed to be how I see what an Onyx Watch Godly could look like, compared to trying to make the most meta and the most powerful 1v1 vehicle. So, this only has 2 turrets. They could be more heavily armored than they are, so this can be blown out pretty badly by some very good penetrating shots that go through the turrets. The fuel engines serve for some decent aim point spoofing, so that helps a little bit. But there are still significant weaknesses. It functioning as a broadsider is also just not good in one-on-one battles. So, as we use my favorite new benchmark again, especially because it falls into a fairly modest cost, and I find is a lot harder to fight usually than something like the Empyrean, although not that the Empyrean is a pushover. It's just that the Pyre is a very extreme example of some of the new building tactics that go into Neater. You know, I'm not really happy with dealing with the nukes here though, so I'm still gonna go ahead and put in two of these guys to just deal with that nuke problem for me. If it's got sub-vehicles, I'm gonna have sub-vehicles too. But we are not going to tank this damage very well, and it is going to tank our damage incredibly well. I've also noticed some issues occasionally with the 5th season with taking too tight an angle against some craft and running into difficulty. Not that we've taken that much damage yet, but the Pyre hasn't either. This battle has just started, and it's going to reach our juicy internals much faster than we'll reach its, because it has this insane amount of highly angled armor to get through, and we have none of its angled, or almost none of its angled, and we have very little armor in general. So we're simply not going to tear through it. The 5th season really needs to punch large holes in craft for it to be effective, and it's just not going to be able to do it through a craft like this. Alright, I moved myself here. So, right now we're making things look pretty fair. And actually we've taken some firepower off the Pyre. Please. Compared to the firepower that's taken off of us. I find that often misleading as barrels get snipped. And that sort of thing. Like, we're still fighting respectably. If we get a few good mortar hits, they can actually do a huge amount of work. The EMP damage is interesting. I know that we do EMP damage, The pirate's actually fighting us from close enough that we're launching our close-range missiles, aren't we? Unfortunate miss from those mortars. You kind of need them to hit. Yeah, that's how you win these fights. If the pyre was something like the Singularity, which this used to be able to kill sometimes and certainly can't with the rebuilt Singularity, then these mortars wouldn't hit and it would be even worse. A few lucky hits with these mortars, which have a lot of armor penetration, can do some real numbers. Let's see if I can get a slightly better. Yeah, that almost went straight through the gun. Right, so now something like the 5th season will just put you on a competitive standing with Godlies, whereas it used to be with the Godlies that it could engage well. It was a really devastating show. Of course, if the pirate itself was built as a broadsider like the 5th season, this wouldn't even be close. The 5th season would absolutely annihilate the pyre. But times have changed. Times have certainly changed. So let me look at one more craft that's changed changed quite a bit, that really changes the nature of fights against some of the neater craft and did not exist when I built the 5th season. But part of this is just to show that these really powerful railguns, that they're not very efficient at DPS. I think it's the gravitas that I want. I always forget these names a little bit. For some reason, I really, really struggle with remembering the Twin Guard names. But with these not high DPS per cost, but high individual firepower per shell, especially that are relying on a lot of armor penetration, these are just not as effective as they used to be. And I would generally shy away from them. So what's going on here? There are some number of shields. There's at least 3. And I was sort of making fun of this a little bit with the Cherub, the fact that the Twin Guard, yes, they actually do this. I didn't actually know about this craft when I built that. I didn't know that they had anything quite this degenerate. Actually, this looks like there are 4 shields here. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Am I missing any? Oh, it goes all the way out here, so... Oh, no, that one's just off-center. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yep, so 7 layers of armor. I can't really tell if this is heavy armor. It's probably more like 5 layers of heavy armor. And these can all line up, too. So you can have to punch through 20 layers of heavy armor to get through these shields, and they get repair spammed incredibly quickly. These stop an entire broadside from the 5th season, and they point directly at your craft through the center of the gravitas. So sometimes you'll shoot around it, and sometimes this will just catch all of your shells, and it dynamically repositions these to catch large missiles as they come through the sphere of effect, making large missiles almost completely ineffectual against this craft. This thing is the biggest cheese ball you could ever put into the campaign, and it's absolutely grotesque, and it's taken any appetite away from me for making similar cheese balls to demonstrate how cheesy some of this technology is. So I was going to make one as my next vehicle, and I've actually moved away from that, and I've already started working on the next vehicle, and it is going to be nothing like this. So fortunately, it's not shooting at our guns, it's shooting at our ability to create energy, which is much more redundant, heavily distributed, and we can deal with not having for a while. So we're putting a few shells into these shields. We never hit quite the middle of them. Now, as much as I've insulted the gravitas about being a massive cheese ball, it's not always completely impossible. It really depends on where it puts its shells into us and how many it catches on the shield. These should absolutely not be a thing. This is absolutely disgusting. I was absolutely making fun of this and not making a suggestion when I made the Cherub. So we've definitely got a lot of really good APHE explosions in the middle of this body. I don't think it actually matters that much, especially because 1, we're not putting very many shells into the actual weaponry, and 2, the weaponry is just going to repair itself. Ooh, that was a really good hit, actually. The Gravitas is circling slightly, so we're not getting our other gun on target, and that's actually a huge problem. The 5th season has lost a lot of its firepower as well. If it was firing with this other weapon, this would be going a lot better. So we still did win. The Gravitas, you know, has an upright torso, so it's not like the Pyre in terms of getting shells into it. But it does use incredibly cheesy twin guard technology. I am not much of a fan of fighting this kind of thing. It also does this heavy armor wedge stacking that's become incredibly common. I think the only reason it lost was probably some deficits in EMP defense. Right, the setter does all of the normal twin guard cheese stuff, where a lot of the essential components to fight well are put out in the sides, where they get repair spammed, and then the core is just this disgustingly tanky brick, which only failed due to a slight lack of EMP defense. So it's not like these things don't have weak spots or ways to kill them, but man, are they rough to fight. And this was not really a consideration when I built craft like the 5th season, craft like the Pyre, the Gravitas. Not stuff I was really worried about fighting too much with them. Nowadays, you certainly have to take these style of vehicles into consideration. I would say this.
Receiving.
This was more concerned with fighting things like the Empyrean and that kind of thing, as well as, you know, being what I felt was probably a reasonable but maybe slightly overtuned Godly in the Onyx Watch department. I think the Kittykame is going to be the last vehicle that I'm going to show off. There are some vehicles that I've made after this. I did videos of them. Neither hasn't changed that much since I built them. To some extent, it hasn't changed that much since I built the Kittykame either, but it has changed a bit. So this has these 2 Kitty Hawks that have these Hesh guns on them, and these are meant to fly over enemy vehicles if it's fighting ships, which this thing is really only intended to be able to fight ships. These dive bombers are too slow to really fight anything else. It peppers small diameter Hesh shells through the top with the intentions of being able to get through lambs and that sort of thing. Cooling limit's really high. It's because of the gun geometry and how little gunpowder's in the thing, and the fact that I was just connecting stuff with the gauge snake. It's got these little danger nuggets. I thought these used to have 60 missile firepower. I don't know if anything actually changed or not, or maybe they just always had 54. I'd have to go back and check. But, oh, it's because I put thumper heads on them. Okay, that's why. They used to just be all frag. I put thumper heads for a little bit more health to help them punch through lambs a little bit. And that's what detuned their firepower. But these guys shoot pure firepower, or pure payload missiles, which is why they have such a high firepower to cost ratio. They're very delicate, but they fly off of a carrier and can come in for some repairs. So I'll put them against a few things. I should talk about the ship as well, because I was talking about the Tycho and saying, yeah, all this empty space, this has really gotten a lot better in terms of defense against a lot of modern Niedercraft compared to how it used to be in the past. Well, the Kittykame is an even more extreme version of that, because I wanted her to be big enough to carry these vehicles, but to not take a very large percentage cost from the fleet. So she does have her own missile barrage, because I wanted her to do something, and it's supposed to soak up lambs and other anti-missile firepower to help these guys punch through a little bit, because they have real issues if lambs blow these frag missiles up while they're still in here. They'll just annihilate themselves. So I wound up with this big vehicle that's made mostly out of wood and stone, with just a little bit of metal surrounding important interior components. This makes it resilient to a lot of damage types. HE is not very effective at killing this craft, even though it's made out of a lot of wood and stone and things that HE are good against. There's so much empty space that it's really hard to blow up with at least large explosions. Peppering it with smaller HE is actually pretty effective though. Frag is a similar thing where a lot of the frag stuff will just go through empty space, but solid shot and armor penetration is really what this is good against. So, going at always my favorite target, which again was rebuilt to not just be incredibly easy to fight, is the Rhea, because the Rhea has better active defenses than she used to, and let's see if we can get these gun barrels to show up. These guns are much better at penetrating enemy armor than they used to, and have a payload component in them as well. I believe they're AP frag or something along those lines. So we start to launch our vehicles off. Well, the Kittykame herself is going to tank most of the offensive firepower. She's launching interceptions for the large missiles that the Kittykame fired off, while these small vehicles dump these missiles in at an incredibly low range, which is hard for a lot of crafts to deal with. So that's a pretty respectable opening barrage. And now the Kitty Hawks themselves get over the enemy. They do want enemies that don't have strong secondaries. Craft and Neater still do not have strong secondaries, so this is a good place to be. Ideally, you want them to start putting shells in through the tops of these turret caps. That tends to be a very, very big weak point for a lot of enemy vehicles. And then the Kittykame herself just sits here sponging damage. She's actually very good at sponging damage. And even when she's destroyed, these will keep, fighting until they actually get injured. Sometimes they crash into each other, have bad luck with missiles, come back for repairs, and if the Kittykame is not functional, well, that's not so great. But... oh, and there's this problem. If we come on in the direction that the enemy vehicle is moving in, we'll often not have these missiles ready in time. I could probably tune it to make it a bit smarter about that. I just never really bothered. But we're going to have another actual bomb barrage ready to come in soon. Maybe. So I can't test the Kittykame against a lot of the newer craft because it just can't. Man, we have not had a very lucky engagement this time. It just can't engage a lot of the more updated craft, which tend to be airships or thruster craft or that kind of thing. But it is still very, very efficient against surface targets, even ones that have been updated. So I'll recall the fleet, skip through the repair process, and then bring in one more vehicle that I think has actually been updated a few times, and at least in reasonably similar cost brackets to the Kittykame, is one of the scarier surface vehicles that I'm aware of. I'm going to spawn her a bit further out so that I actually have time to launch my craft before the Kittykame starts getting hit by too much munitions. The Stralsund, I find the Stralsund quite scary, even if her strength difficulty modifier is less than 1, which is not what you'd expect for a Godly. It might be because she already has so much firepower that they don't want to give her a big difficulty modifier. The difficulty modifier is often just to make craft godly when their stats do not indicate that they should be godly. So she does have the ability to actually fire back against these craft. It's not terribly successful, but she can do it. I wish I could stagger these a little bit more, but then the takeoff time would just be way too long. Maybe I should still do it anyway. Oh, she intercepted some of those missiles. So, decent first engagement. Of course, her alpha strike potential is incredible as well. And missiles are... they're just good. I don't think her guns are that effective against the Kittykame. Her missiles, however, are. And went straight into the center, so we lost a lot of our docking ability. Still see that thump damage racking up from the Hesh, though. You can't tell how much of the fragmentation is from the Hesh, but 60 firepower in each of these guns, just chipping away constantly. It's a lot. They're mostly okay at not killing the danger nuggets, but they're not incredible. Of course, these won't all recall because of damage dealt to the Kittykame, and even the ones that do might just die. Again, this is the same difficulty I was talking about before. We're coming through the head-on, they might not have their bombs ready in time. Those two craft didn't. The Hesh damage, though, still pretty scary. These bombs, also pretty scary. These are also very small flyers, so when they do go in for repairs, they launch again almost instantaneously. I'm surprised that there was not a collision there. I was really waiting for one. And they're just pretty cost-effective at dealing damage. So, I'm actually very happy with how the Kittykame has aged. She's still not effective against a very wide variety of targets because of how she was built. I do want to make another carrier, and I want to make it much more effective against a wider variety of targets, so rather than just all dive bombers, have some air-to-air craft, have some things that are good at taking out big ships, things that are good at taking out smaller vehicles, something that's just a bit more flexible, but it's definitely a direction that I want to go to in the future. And despite all of this damage, especially from things like HE, these little metal wraps really do a good job of redirecting the HE damage through the softer, lower armor components like stone and wood, and leave her functioning with just massive gaping wounds everywhere. Especially with plasma becoming a thing, again, as I said for the Tycho, I am going to want to look to see if this armor scheme becomes even better in the future. Of course, I don't do stuff like this as you start to get into higher cost brackets because you just get too much volume. You wind up with too many blocks, too much volume, slows the game down, stops you from spotting in a lot of ships. And this is the end of my retrospective, so hopefully this covers both some of the changes in how I've built craft, things that I've learned, things that maybe I've failed to learn, as well as given at least a little bit of a history into how Niter has changed. Of course, I'm not looking through any historical craft here. I'm mostly looking at whether or not my old vehicles are effective or not effective against current Niter compared to my recollection of how they performed in the past. So definitely a lot of room for biases one way or the other. But I feel for me this is at least somewhat educational. And I've looked at a few of the newer Niter craft because of this as well, because I've wanted to see how things have evolved. And this has changed sort of my views moving forwards for how I'm going to build at least my next few craft and what I'm going to work on. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I certainly enjoyed making it, although it took me quite a bit longer than I thought it was going to initially. And I've skipped a very large section of my craft. I really haven't shown off that many in general because I didn't want to bloat this video any more than I already had to. Anyway, I'll see you in the future.